The NES Kunio games. Everyone knows them, everyone loves them. In fact, they've now all been translated and released officially. But what doesn't get talked about as much are the other 8-bit Kunio games on the Game Boy. Few of these have been released outside of Japan, and most don't even have translations. In this video, I just want to go over all the games in release order since I've now played and finished them all. And I'll let you know if I think the game is worthwhile or not. Of course, you should probably play all of these games yourself and form your own opinions about them. But if you don't feel like doing that, trust me, bro. So first we're starting off with one of the absolute best Kunio games for the Game Boy, and crazy enough, it was the first one released, and that is Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun Bangai Ranto Hen, which was released in the US as simply Double Dragon 2. The Kunio version is the original, but the gameplay was slightly modified for the US release, which came out a year later. The sprites, of course, are also changed, as well as the music. You can't go wrong with either of them, and frankly this might be the best beat 'em up on the Game Boy. There's not much competition besides, well, the other Double Dragon games except the third one. Don't even bother. Given that this is currently my favorite beat 'em up for the Game Boy, I give it an easy thumbs up, or should I say recommendation. In this game, you're not going to be seeing many of the iconic moves from the Kunio series, or coin drops, or shops. This is more of a Double Dragon or Renegade title than it is a Kunio game, which is why originally it was going to be localized as a sequel to the original Renegade, and you'll see the same locations like the opening subway from Renegade. Despite being the second game in the Double Dragon trilogy for the Game Boy, this game is a very reasonable difficulty level, and there's not much I would change about it except making the enemies a little smarter, and having weapons the player could pick up and use would also be cool, which some of the later Kunio games on Game Boy do implement. And apparently this game has 2-player, which may make the game more interesting, but I actually don't know a single person that is willing to play this in 2-player in 2023, so I actually couldn't tell you. Next we got Nintendo World Cup, released in Japan as Neketsu Koko Soccer Boo World Cup Hen. Despite being on Game Boy, it doesn't really feel like many sacrifices were made for this version. The NES game is already fairly slow, so unlike some of these other Kunio sports titles, the speed did not need to be sacrificed here. And maybe it's just me, but this game feels smoother to play than the NES version. Now look, I've never been a fan of soccer, but this game actually managed to make it fairly fun with the super shots, and also instead of scoring on your opponents, I like that this game lets you just beat them up until they can't move anymore. This game is pretty much the only soccer game I've ever enjoyed, although it does get boring after a while. I give it a light recommendation. Well, those were the only 2 Game Boy Kunio games released outside of Japan, which leaves us with all of the Japan-only titles. Despite Super Dodgeball being released on the NES, Neketsu Koko Dodgeball Boo never made it over here. And there may be a reason for that. This game is not very good. This is the first game in this video where we really start to see the limitations of the Game Boy. The NES game suffered from slowdown, but is still very fun and easily one of my favorite NES sports titles. The Game Boy game is much slower and feels impossible to control properly, I would assume because there's simply way too many character sprites on screen at a time. The flickering, which seems to be even worse in this version, tries to solve the too many sprites problem, but it doesn't work out very well and the game just feels awful to play. This is easily the worst Kunio game on the Game Boy, and the first one I will tell you to stay away from. Also, the soundtrack in this game actually hurts my ears much of the time, very unfortunate when compared to the great soundtrack found on the NES. I mean, just listen to it. Downtown Neketsu Koshin Kyokyu Doko Demo Daiun Dokai is a Game Boy version of the NES game Downtown Neketsu March Super Awesome Field Day. The NES game is actually very enjoyable in my opinion. Sadly, it seems not many have played it. The game is basically a racing game consisting of many funny obstacles to avoid. Before finishing these races, you can play dirty and eliminate all the opponents one by beating them to death, preventing them from scoring, which is what I like to do. This tactic is much harder to pull off in this Game Boy version though. I found it very easy to do on NES. Unfortunately, I feel that this is another game that suffers from the Game Boy's limitations. The Game Boy levels are less interesting as they're missing some sections, which makes the game quite a bit shorter. The game is also just slower in general, which makes it a bit less fun, on, one of the all-out brawls at the end is slightly different as there is a bomb you have to watch out for which may attach to you, which is randomly chosen. The victim has a chance to get rid of it by attaching it to someone else. Whoever it explodes on scores 0 points, which is devastating for whichever team. I give this game a sideways thumbs up. You should probably just play the NES game, but if you're curious about this version, it's not too bad, just a lesser experience. Bikuri Neketsu Shin Kuroku Doko Demo Kin Medal is a Game Boy version of the NES game Crash and the Boys Street Challenge. And I'm just gonna say it right now, this is my favorite Kunio game on the handheld. I do like Crash on the Boys on NES more than this still, and if you don't like that game, you're probably not gonna like this one either. This Game Boy version is certainly slower, but it plays well, no complications that I'm aware of. I actually prefer some of the differences in this version, like changing the swimming event to an umbrella battle where you're falling and fighting over an umbrella. I just think it's way cooler than the swimming one. But yeah, if you don't know anything about either games, you basically compete with 4 schools in a bunch of Olympic-style contests. You've probably seen quite a few other 8-bit games like this, but this is the most fun one to my knowledge. The main difference, of course, being the Kunio wackiness you've come to expect from this series. Basically, whichever team accumulates the most medals at the end wins. You can also use these medals to buy things, which make the challenges easier. You just gotta make sure you don't spend too many medals since you still need enough to win in the end. Anyway, easy recommendation, moving on. Downtown Special Kunio-kun no Jidai Geki Daio Zenin Shugo, known as Downtown Special Kunio-kun's historical period drama on the NES, is a sequel to the beloved game River City Ransom. Now why the hell did we never get a Game Boy version of River City Ransom and they prioritized other games? Anyway, this is a Jidai Geki game, meaning it takes place in feudal Japan, and interestingly enough, the Yakuza series also has Jidai Geki games, and I'm convinced that Yakuza got many of its ideas from Kunio, but that's off topic. This game may be a sequel, but it's not that similar as far as the formula used. You beat people up, get some money, spend it, learn some moves, level up, so in that sense it's similar. But the game consists of wandering around the world hoping some opposing clans show up so you can defeat their boss. This game gets unbelievably repetitive quite fast, and I spent more time just trying to find these teams in the first place than actually fighting them. And fighting them seems to depend heavily on RNG. If in River City Ransom you know what to do, you can beat the game quite fast, which I think adds to its replayability. Every time you play this, it will be the same mind-numbingly repetitive experience with wandering around the world hoping to encounter every enemy clan and eliminating them. Which, by the way, the clans are supposed to have different colors from one another, which doesn't really work all too well with the Game Boy. At least this Game Boy version is a well-made conversion that doesn't have any problems with its gameplay. It's just missing minor details in the environment like moving water. But seriously, why couldn't we get River City Ransom instead of this? If this was possible on the Game Boy, so was that. I also played this game on NES with a friend since the Kunio bundle on Switch has it online, and having a second player did not make this game any more fun, instead it was just one more bored person. 2 players also possible on Game Boy, but like I said, it doesn't really make the game any more fun, and who is gonna do that? So with that in mind, I do not recommend this game and I'm giving it a thumbs down. Neketsu Beach Volley Daio Kunio-kun is the last Kunio-kun released for the Game Boy, and it's sad that this is not only the last 8-bit Kunio game ever made, but the series would only see one more release in the next 10 years. This game is inoffensive, but also unremarkable. I've never really been into volleyball, so maybe if I was, I might somehow enjoy this game more, but this is easily the most standard of the Kunio sports games that I've played. Unfortunately, in this game you don't get to beat up your opponents, and while there's not too much to the game besides attempting to do power spikes, which I don't even know how to do in this game honestly because I couldn't find anything online about the controls. I mean, this really is a fairly standard volleyball game as far as gameplay, it's just been Kunio-fied in its presentation. And I don't know, I didn't find this game to be all that engaging. You kind of just wait until it's your turn to attempt to spike the ball. And maybe it's just me, but I found lining up with the ball was quite a challenge. I'm gonna give this one a sideways thumb since I certainly can't say that it's bad. I bet if you get good at this game it can be pretty fun. I was just not able to. Also, if you happen to like both volleyball and Kunio, you may as well check it out. I mean, this game only exists on Game Boy and there's not some better version of it out there. So you could say it's kind of novel because of that. So to summarize, these are the games I think are quality and you should play. These games, play if you're curious, but they're not for me, and these games are honestly just kind of bad.